I can still feel the chill of that lobby floor under my shoes, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead, and the weight of a lunch I'd made with love turning heavy in my hands. And then, those casual words from the attendant, the ones that split my world in half before I could even process the sound of them. My husband's wife. I remember standing there, frozen, trying to breathe around the sudden hollowness in my chest. If you've ever trusted someone so deeply that the truth nearly knocked the air out of you, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from, because this kind of moment is lonelier than people admit. I walked back to my car in a daze that afternoon, unaware that one sentence had just opened the door to a life I didn't know existed. Let me show you how it all began. I still remember the way the lobby lights reflected off the glass as I walked into Greg's office building that morning. My name is Marianne Porter, and within minutes of stepping through those doors, the life I thought I had was cut clean in half. I had driven across Portland with a simple plan in mind. I wanted to bring Greg his favorite turkey and avocado sandwich, a small gesture to remind him he wasn't alone in the whirlwind of deadlines he always talked about. It felt good, carrying that little lunch bag, like I was doing something loving, something grounding. But the moment I approached the reception desk, something shifted. The young attendant looked at me with that polite smile people use when they think they're helping. When he checked the visitor log and told me Greg had already left with his wife, I felt the floor beneath me tilt. For a second, I convinced myself I'd misheard him, but the calm certainty in his voice made the truth land heavy. Inside, everything went quiet. Not dramatic, not loud, just a sudden stillness that hollowed me out. I stood there, nodding like nothing was wrong, while the words replayed themselves in my mind. His wife, as if I didn't exist at all. I walked back to my car with the untouched lunch still in my hands. I sat there, staring at my own reflection in the windshield, trying to understand how a moment so ordinary could split my world open. I didn't cry. My body felt too numb for that. All I could think was how strange it felt to realize something had been wrong long before this moment, and somehow I had missed it. And that was when I realized I needed to look back to the beginning of our marriage, back to the signs I had ignored. Looking back on my marriage to Greg, it's strange how 23 years can feel both solid and fragile at the same time. We met young, when life still felt wide open, and for a long while I believed we were building something steady together. I slipped naturally into the role of the one who held everything in place. I managed the home, the bills, the schedules, the quiet parts of life that keep a family moving. Greg's world was louder, faster, always demanding more of him. He thrived on the pressure, and I kept telling myself that supporting him was the same thing as being valued. For years, I thought our balance made sense. He chased promotions and late meetings, and I made sure there was a warm meal waiting and a house that felt stable. I used to reassure myself that love didn't always look like grand gestures. Sometimes it looked like constancy, like showing up every day even when the days blurred together. But when I replay those years now, I see moments I brushed aside. The nights he came home long after he said he would, the guarded way he handled his phone, the exhaustion in my own reflection that I kept ignoring because it was easier to believe we were fine. I didn't let myself name those feelings back then. I told myself every marriage had seasons, and ours was simply passing through a demanding one. Yet as I sat in my car that afternoon, clutching the untouched lunch, a quiet awareness settled in. Maybe the truth had been whispering to me for years, and I was only just beginning to listen. And that realization followed me home, tightening into something heavier, something that would become real fear in the hours ahead. I remember walking back to my car as if I were moving underwater, every sound muffled, every step out of sync with the world around me. The sandwich I had made for Greg felt heavier than it should have, as if all the weight of what I'd just heard had settled into that small container. I slid into the driver's seat and closed the door, and the silence that followed wrapped around me like a cold sheet. I kept seeing the attendant's face in my mind, the casual way she spoke as though she were stating something obvious, something I should have already known. My husband's wife. The phrase echoed in me, knocking against all the memories I had used to convince myself our life was steady. I stared down at the untouched lunch and felt a tremor of fear run through me, quiet, but unmistakable. As I sat there, pieces of the past began nudging their way forward. The nights Greg stayed late without explanation. The weekends he said he needed time to decompress. The trips he claimed were work-related but felt oddly last-minute. Back then, I smoothed over those questions before they could take shape. But in that moment, sitting alone in my car, they took on a sharper edge. The drive home felt strangely calm, almost hollow. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't cry. I just gripped the steering wheel and tried to breathe through the thought that maybe this wasn't a misunderstanding at all. When I finally walked through my front door, still holding that untouched lunch, the fear had settled into something heavier, something that would sharpen into certainty the moment I found the first real piece of evidence. I tried to settle myself by slipping back into the familiar rhythms of home, but even the simplest tasks felt off. I picked up Greg's laundry the way I had 1,000 times before, telling myself routine might steady me. But when I reached into the pocket of his slacks, my fingers brushed a piece of paper that didn't belong there. I pulled it out, expecting something harmless. Instead, I found a receipt from a restaurant downtown, dated on a night he had sworn he was working late. I stared at the list of items, my eyes locking on the 2 entrees, the 2 drinks, the slow-paced courses that no one orders alone. In an instant, I was back in our kitchen that evening, remembering the way he'd said he was exhausted, the way I'd tried not to worry. Now the memory felt distorted, as if I were finally seeing it from the outside. A slow heat rose in my chest, not a burst of anger, but a tightening, a recognition. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a misplaced comment from a stranger in a lobby. This was proof. And it marked the moment I stopped trying to protect the story I had been telling myself for years. I folded the receipt carefully and placed it exactly where I found it, almost ritualistically, as though disturbing it might tip my hand too soon. I wasn't ready to confront him. Not yet. I needed to see the whole picture, not just pieces. As I moved through the rest of the laundry, my breathing steadied, and that was when my hand closed around something small, metallic, and entirely out of place. A key that would change everything. I kept folding laundry to steady my breathing, telling myself that if I just stayed focused on small motions, I wouldn't unravel. But when I moved from the laundry to Greg's work bag, something in me tightened. I had gone into that bag countless times for receipts or loose change, never expecting anything out of the ordinary. This time, when I tipped it slightly to check the bottom compartment, a small metallic clink hit the hardwood floor. I looked down and saw a key lying next to my foot. At first, I thought it might belong to one of our neighbors or maybe a spare for his office. But when I picked it up, I noticed a thin metal tag attached to it. Riverline Lofts, Unit 312. The words felt like they were carved directly into my chest. My hands actually shook, not dramatically, just enough that I had to slow my breathing to keep the key from slipping. I felt a cold clarity settle over me, the kind that comes when your mind stops fighting and finally accepts what it already knows. This wasn't an office key. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a door to a life I knew nothing about. I stood there for a long moment, holding that key like it might burn me. I imagined Greg carrying it around every day, moving through our home with this secret pressed against his wallet as casually as a grocery list. The quiet betrayal of that thought was almost worse than the discovery itself. When I finally placed the key back exactly where it had fallen from, I felt a strange steadiness return. I didn't slam the bag shut. I didn't cry. I simply knew what I had to do. If there was an apartment tied to Unit 312, I needed to see it with my own eyes, and I needed to go there before any more truth slipped through my fingers. I drove to Riverline Lofts early on Saturday morning, hoping the quiet would steady me, but the closer I got, the more the air felt too thin to breathe. The building sat near the river, clean and modern, the kind of place young professionals chose when they wanted convenience and style. I parked across the street and held the key in my hand, feeling its cold edge press into my palm as if urging me forward. I told myself I only needed to see the building, just confirm it existed. But minutes after I stepped out of my car, I saw Greg. He walked toward the entrance with a woman I recognized from a work event years ago, Hannah Reed, younger, effortlessly polished, moving beside him with a comfort that made my stomach twist. He held the door for her, and they disappeared inside like a couple returning home after a pleasant morning out. In that moment, denial finally slipped out of my grasp. This wasn't an affair tucked into stolen evenings. This was a life, built deliberately, brick by brick, while I kept our home standing on my own. I waited until they left again, laughing softly as they crossed the courtyard. Only then did I walk to the entrance, my hand steady as I used the key. Inside, the air held the faint scent of lavender detergent and something warm, like vanilla candles. The apartment was lived in, not occasionally visited, lived in. There were clothes in the closet, his and hers, a pair of running shoes he had never worn at home, toiletries lined up neatly on the bathroom counter. Photos on the wall showed them at a summer festival, standing close enough that their shoulders touched naturally, like it had been that way for a long time. I moved slowly through each room, absorbing the truth until the shock became something still and sharp inside me. When I finally stepped back into the hallway, I closed the door without a sound. I slipped the key into my pocket and walked toward my car with a new, unwavering resolve. I wasn't going to confront him yet. I was going to gather everything I needed. I went back to the apartment early the next morning, the key warm in my hand from how tightly I held it. The shock from the day before had settled into something steadier, a quiet resolve that guided my steps. When I opened the door this time, I didn't pause to take in the scene. I walked straight to the desk in the corner, the place where truth usually hides. I started photographing everything. Mail addressed to Greg at this unit, bank statements showing transfers I had never heard about, insurance documents listing Hannah as his emergency contact. Each image felt like another stitch tightening a seam inside me, holding me together rather than tearing me apart. Then I found the folder. Inside were draft divorce papers with my name at the top. The narrative he had crafted painted me as the unstable spouse, someone impossible to live with. Reading those words, I felt a brief wave of heat rise in my chest, but it wasn't the same kind of pain as before. It was clarity. It was confirmation. He hadn't just built a second life. He had been preparing to erase me from the first. I kept documenting. I photographed the drafts, the financial inconsistencies, the notes he had made in the margins. Page after page revealed the shape of his plan, a version of our life where I was already gone. When I finished, I placed everything back exactly where it had been. I locked the door behind me and walked to my car with a calm I hadn't felt in years. It was time to protect myself. Time to speak with an attorney who could help me navigate the truth I now held in my hands. Alex Bowman's office felt unnervingly calm, a quiet space with soft lighting and shelves lined with casebooks. I remember sitting across from him with my hands folded tightly in my lap, feeling the weight of everything I had uncovered. When I laid out the photos and documents, he studied each one with a steady focus that eased something inside me. I didn't need dramatic reactions. I needed clarity, and he gave it to me. As he walked me through what the evidence meant, I felt a strange mix of relief and grief settle over me. The financial transfers I didn't recognize, the insurance documents listing someone else, the apartment lease, it all painted a picture of deliberate misconduct. Hearing him confirm that Greg's actions crossed legal and ethical lines didn't feel vindicating. It felt necessary, like someone finally turning on the lights in a dark room I'd been stumbling through for years. We built a plan together, careful and quiet. I opened my own bank account that afternoon. I gathered every document tied to our finances, copying statements and securing what I needed before anything could disappear. I learned how to file first, how to protect myself, how to prepare without tipping my hand. At home, I kept my voice steady and my routines intact. I cooked dinner, folded laundry, answered his questions with calm civility. But underneath that stillness, something had shifted. I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't confused. I was preparing, and when the moment came to confront him, I knew I would do it with the same quiet certainty that had carried me this far. I woke up early that morning and laid everything out on the kitchen table, the photos, the statements, the drafts, each page aligned in a quiet, deliberate order. The house felt still, almost peaceful, and for the first time in weeks, my hands didn't shake. I sat there waiting, listening to the familiar sounds of Greg moving around upstairs. When he finally walked into the kitchen, he looked relaxed, almost cheerful, as if the world were unchanged. I remember watching that ease fall from his face the moment he noticed the papers. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask questions. I simply told him, in the calmest way I knew how, that I was aware of everything. The apartment, the transfers, the plans he'd drafted without me. He stumbled through half-formed excuses, but I felt no pull to absorb them. There was nothing left to interpret, nothing left to rescue. The truth was already on the table between us. I told him I had spoken with an attorney, that the legal process had already begun, and that whatever story he had been writing about me would no longer shape my future. His panic rose, but I stayed grounded, steady in a way I hadn't felt in years. And as I stood up from that table, I understood that the real fallout was only just beginning. In the hours after our confrontation, Greg moved through the house like a man trying to escape his own shadow. He grabbed clothes at random, muttering to himself, pacing from one room to another as if he could outrun the truth laid out on the kitchen table. By the afternoon, he was gone. No note, no explanation, just absence, loud and heavy. The filing went through the next morning. I remember standing in the clerk's office, feeling strangely steady as the paperwork was stamped. It didn't feel triumphant. It felt necessary, like closing a door that had been hanging off its hinges for years. On my drive home, my phone buzzed. A long, frantic message from Greg accusing me of betrayal, of ruining his life, of misunderstanding everything. I read it once, then turned my phone face down. His story no longer had power over me. Within days, the board at his company opened an internal review. The evidence of his financial misconduct, forwarded anonymously, triggered the kind of scrutiny he had always assumed he was immune to. Watching it unfold from a distance felt surreal. His name slowly disappeared from corporate directories. Meetings he once led were reassigned. Eventually, a short announcement confirmed what everyone already knew: he had resigned. I didn't celebrate. I didn't tell friends or whisper it to myself like a victory. I simply acknowledged that consequences had followed truth, the way they often do when you stop protecting the wrong person. Greg spiraled publicly, sending scattered messages I chose not to answer. I kept my world quiet, choosing peace over participation. As the dust settled, I realized I felt something I hadn't known in years: room to breathe. And with that space came the first fragile thought of rebuilding, of piecing together a life that belonged entirely to me. Moving into my new apartment felt like stepping into a life I had quietly wished for without ever admitting it. The space was smaller than the house Greg and I once shared, but it felt open in a way that had nothing to do with square footage. Morning light poured through the windows in soft stripes, and for the first time in years, I woke up without bracing myself for the weight of someone else's moods. I spent the first weeks learning how to build a life that felt like mine. I cooked meals I actually wanted, arranged my bookshelves in a way that made sense to me, and took long evening walks without needing to explain where I was going. Slowly, I began to feel pieces of myself returning, interests I had abandoned, quiet joys I had ignored, friendships I had let grow cold under the strain of keeping up appearances. I found myself drawn toward volunteer work at a local women's center, listening to stories from women who had walked roads similar to mine. Offering support felt natural, almost grounding. It reminded me that healing isn't just about moving on. It's about creating meaning from what tried to break you. Greg reached out a few times, mostly scattered messages that swung between regret and defensiveness. I read them with a calm distance I never expected to feel. I didn't need apologies or explanations. Some chapters end without tidy conclusions, and that's its own form of clarity. As seasons shifted and my life grew steadier, I felt a quiet gratitude take root, a recognition that survival had slowly turned into something richer. And in that calm, I realized there was one final thing I wanted to share, not about Greg, but about the life that comes after. Healing didn't come in a single moment. It came in small breaths, quiet mornings, and the steady reminder that I was allowed to choose myself. Betrayal shook my life apart, but it also cleared space for a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. And looking back now, I realized the real victory wasn't exposing Greg or watching consequences unfold. It was reclaiming my own worth, step by step, without losing my softness. If you're listening and carrying your own hurt, I hope you remember this. You are allowed to walk away from what breaks you. You are allowed to rebuild, and you deserve a life that feels honest and gentle and yours. Thank you for spending this time with me. If any part of my story resonated, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever faced something like this? Share your experience in the comments. I read everyone,